The invisible passenger on the boat. Marina and I needed a break. The routine was suffocating us, and all we wanted was to escape the city and relax for a while. So, we rented a boat to explore a remote stretch of river, a place famous for its untouched beauty and absolute calm. It was perfect. Dense vegetation formed a natural tunnel, and the silence was almost sacred, interrupted only by the sound of water and leaves in the wind. As soon as we arrived, we prepared for what we expected to be a peaceful weekend. Marina organized things on the boat while I took care of the supplies. By late afternoon, we had anchored in a secluded spot, surrounded by the forest. We wanted to disconnect from everything and reconnect with nature. The first night was wonderful. We dined under a starry sky, laughed, and talked until sleep overtook us. The boat swayed gently like a cradle, and the sound of the water was soothing. But a little after 2 in the morning, I was awakened by a strange sound. At first I thought it was the wind, but soon I realized it had a rhythm. It sounded like footsteps, light and slow, echoing on the deck. Marina woke up soon after and asked if I had heard it too. The footsteps continued, one after another, as if someone was walking around the cabin. I grabbed a flashlight and went out to check. I shone the light across every corner of the deck, but there was nothing, only the quiet river and the darkness of the surrounding trees. I returned to the cabin, trying to convince myself it was just an animal passing by. The next morning, Marina joked, calling me a ghost hunter. We laughed together, but I was still uneasy. I checked the deck, looking for footprints or any sign, but found nothing to explain the footsteps. Still, we enjoyed the rest of the day, sailing and exploring. On the second night, the atmosphere changed. A low fog blanketed the river, giving the place a somber feel. While Marina was preparing dinner, I decided to turn on the radio to play some music, but all that came through was an eerie static, mixed with fragments of distorted voices, like faint echoes. I turned off the radio. Moments later, the footsteps returned, clearer and slower, as if the presence was getting closer. Marina and I exchanged a frightened look, and that's when we heard it. A child's voice said, "Come play with me." The voice seemed to echo through the cabin, moving from side to side, while the boat's lights began to flicker. I tried to calm Marina, but I was terrified myself. We decided to leave the cabin, but the door was inexplicably locked. We pulled at the handle, but it felt like something was holding it shut, trapping us inside. Suddenly, the boat began to sway as if someone outside was pushing it. The footsteps grew louder, and a soft but disturbing laugh filled the air. Marina started to cry, and I desperately tried to force the door open. After several tense minutes, the rocking stopped, and silence settled in. With one final effort, I managed to open the door and pulled Marina outside. We breathed a sigh of relief on the deck, but it didn't last. Looking back at the cabin, I saw fogged-up glass on the window with small handprints, like those of a child, and fresh, wet streaks sliding down as if they had just been left there. Shaking, I maneuvered the boat toward the nearest shore. We disembarked without looking back, abandoning the boat at a makeshift dock, and walking until we reached a road. We never returned to that river. Months later, we heard a local legend about a child who had disappeared in the river decades ago. People said the child's spirit still roamed the area, trying to lure someone to keep it company. Today, whenever I'm near a lake or a river, I occasionally hear that same soft, eerie laugh echoing in my mind. The Lighthouse of Solitude. Me and 4 experienced fishermen decided it was time for an adventure, so we planned a night fishing trip to a remote region, famous for its abundant waters, but also for its dark stories. The night seemed perfect. The sky was clear, filled with stars, and the calmness of the sea gave a sense of tranquility, a stark contrast to the legends we'd heard about the place. We navigated for hours until, finally, we spotted a small rocky island. At its center stood an imposing, decommissioned lighthouse, seeming to watch us as we approached. The lighthouse was an old structure, its walls covered in moss and algae, with broken windows that looked like empty eyes observing our arrival. It was said that the lighthouse had been abandoned decades ago and that locals avoided talking about it. Rumor had it that lost sailors wandered the island, unable to find peace. But we were seasoned fishermen. We'd seen many strange things at sea, and such tales weren't enough to scare us away. We anchored near the island and began setting up our gear. The plan was simple: catch as many fish as we could and leave at dawn. But as we adjusted the nets, Jonas looked up, and when I followed his gaze, I saw a pale figure at the top of the lighthouse, slowly waving at us, its outline blurred by the mist gathering around the island. The gesture was slow, almost mechanical, and even without seeing its face clearly, the figure radiated an aura of sadness and isolation. I called the others over to look. They saw it too, but none of us could believe our eyes. We tried to laugh it off, pretending it was just a reflection, but all of us sensed something was wrong. It was hard to imagine anyone still living in that lighthouse, but the sight was unmistakable. We decided to ignore it, forcing ourselves to focus on our work and dismiss it as an illusion. After all, we had a job to do. But the stillness of the night was shattered minutes later. The fog grew thicker, the air colder and damper, creating an oppressive atmosphere, as if the sea itself was closing in around us. Visibility dropped, and even the lighthouse, so close by, began to vanish in the mist. In the darkness, we heard a deep, slow voice, seeming to come from every direction at once, muttering words we couldn't understand, like a mournful lament. As the voice echoed, Paolo, the youngest of the group, suddenly went pale. He slowly turned his face, and I realized something was wrong. He was staring blankly into the void, and when I tried to call his name, he didn't respond. That's when I saw it, a dark figure beside him, in tattered, soaked clothes, with empty eyes that seemed to carry an eternity of sorrow. "You never should have come here," the figure whispered, its voice thick with bitterness. Panic took hold of me. But what scared me the most was realizing that the others couldn't see what I was seeing. They looked at me and Paolo, confused by our terror. I tried to scream, but my voice felt trapped in my throat. It was as if the presence was draining my energy, leaving me weak and powerless. The boat began to rock violently, equipment scattering across the deck. Now even those who hadn't seen or heard anything before were gripped by fear, as the whispers turned into screams of agony, piercing the silence and filling us with dread. We looked back at the lighthouse. The figure that had been at the top was now descending, slowly approaching us, like a living shadow creeping forward. Its face was etched with profound sadness, and it pointed at us with a long, bony finger, as if condemning us. We desperately tried to start the engine, but it was as if all power had been drained. Each attempt to start it was futile. In a last act of desperation, Jonas lit an emergency flare, hoping the light would fend off the terrifying presence. The flickering flame offered a brief respite, a moment of silence. But when I looked around, I realized the figure from the lighthouse was now on the deck, right in front of us, closer than ever. The figure was that of a man with a face full of suffering, his eyes carrying the weight of ages of loneliness. He stretched out a pale hand toward us, and in a voice mixing anger with despair, he said, "No one escapes the lighthouse. You're next." At that moment, the fog suddenly began to lift, revealing the calm sea and the starry sky above. The figure disappeared as mysteriously as it had appeared, and the engine roared to life. Without hesitation, I steered the boat away from the island as fast as possible, never looking back. On the way back, no one said a word, but each of us carried the same image in our minds, the dark, lonely lighthouse, a sentinel of terror. Since that night, we have never spoken of what happened. From then on, each of us has been haunted by dreams of the lighthouse, waking up with the feeling of a cold touch on our shoulders. Because, in the end, no one truly escapes the lighthouse. The Mist of the River, a true story. So, here it goes. Let me tell you about the most bizarre experience I've ever had. Even now I get chills just thinking about it. It all happened about 3 summers ago. I've always had this curiosity, This attraction to places no one else dares to explore. Places with dark stories. That time, the plan was to camp on the bank of a river that, according to the locals, had a strange past. People said the river wasn't just a spot for fishing or peaceful kayak trips. According to them, decades ago, people would vanish mysteriously in the dark waters, especially as the sun went down. Of course, I laughed it off. Small town legend, I thought. Just stories to give a place some mystique. But my curiosity was stronger than my fear. And that night, I was there with my tent set up and a small campfire, right in front of the river. The place was dead quiet, and the sound of the water was actually calming at first. I grabbed my phone hoping to get a signal, but the reception was terrible. I was about to turn it off when I caught a strange smell, strong and foul. It was like dead fish mixed with something rotten, something I can't even describe. I stood up, looked around, trying to find the source of the smell, but nothing. No trash, no dead animal, nothing. It was like the smell was clinging to the air, coming straight from the river. I thought about leaving, but something held me there. And that's when I saw it. Through the mist forming over the river, a figure appeared. It wasn't a shadow, or a reflection, or a fallen branch. It was a female figure, a woman dressed in white, seemingly walking on the water surface. I thought it was my mind playing tricks, an illusion caused by the dim firelight. But she stayed there, still and silent, moving with slow, deliberate steps, as if floating on the water. Her image became clearer with each second. She had long, dark hair that covered most of her face, but what stunned me was her skin. It was pale, as white as marble, almost translucent. And then her eyes, they were a blank, opaque white, staring straight at me. It was as if I was the only thing that mattered to her. Then I heard her voice. It didn't come from her mouth, but went straight into my head, like someone planting thoughts that weren't my own. "Come, the water is calm, safe, come." Her voice was soft, like a breeze whispering, but it had a sinister undertone, something that seemed to wrap around me. I took a step forward without even realizing it. My body seemed to move on its own, hypnotized by her presence. As I got closer, the river began to change. The previously calm water started to ripple, with small waves lapping against the shore, as if the river itself was reacting to something. The waves grew stronger, crashing louder, and that awful smell intensified, choking me. The woman remained there, now closer, her face visible. Her skin looked decayed, wrinkled and worn, as if she had been dragged for years in the depths. Her white eyes were empty, yet somehow they radiated an absence of life. She extended a pale hand toward me, and her whisper grew louder, more insistent. "Come, the water is safe." Every word seemed to overpower me, filling me with an urge to step into the river. The waves kept hitting harder, and the stench of rot felt as though it was sticking to my skin, my clothes, everything around me. I couldn't hold back any longer. But then a sense of awareness snapped me back, like something was pulling me away. Suddenly, I realized the real danger and turned, running as fast as I could. Every step, I felt the river and that presence drawing closer, as if something was following me. The whispers continued, calling to me, echoing in my head. "Come." I reached my car, breathless, my heart pounding. I got in, slammed the door shut, and looked back one last time at the river. The mist was slowly dissipating, and for a split second, I swear I saw her figure at the water's edge, watching me, waiting for me to return. That image is still burned in my mind. It felt so real that I still smell that rotting stench every time I close my eyes. After that night, I never went back to the river. What I saw, what I heard, none of it has left me in peace. Sometimes, on silent nights, I still catch the scent of that foul river, and I hear her whispering, as if she's calling to me again, trying to lure me back. In my dreams, she's there waiting, calling, ready to take me under. The captain of the ghost ship. Let me tell you the most unsettling story I've ever experienced at sea. I've spent most of my life sailing and facing storms, but nothing prepared me for what happened that night. My name is Carlos, and I was hired to lead a small crew on an old cargo ship, one that had crossed far too many oceans, with a worn-out hull and rusted metal. The route we were taking was dangerous, passing near a reef known as the Sea's Graveyard, a place feared by any true sailor. They said many ships had wrecked there and that the souls of the crew still roamed the dark waters, waiting for company. The trip was going smoothly, without any major issues, until the third night. The sky, once full of stars, turned heavy with dark clouds. Fierce winds blew, and the crashing waves were deafening. Even for us, who were used to extreme conditions, something felt off. It was as if the sea itself was restless, warning us to turn back. It was close to midnight when the fog began to roll in. At first it was just a thin layer, but soon it grew so thick that the horizon disappeared, and we felt completely isolated. I was on the bow, watching, when I spotted a shadow in the mist. I moved closer, trying to see more clearly. Then, for a brief moment, the fog parted. An ancient ship was adrift, floating on the dark waters. It looked like something out of another era, with torn sails and a broken mast, its hull covered in algae and slime. It was surreal, a vision I'd only ever heard of in legends. I tried to steer the cargo ship away, but it was as if we were locked onto it, unable to move. None of my maneuvers worked. As we drew closer, I saw a lone figure on the bow of the ship. It was an old captain with a dripping beard and clothes worn by time, staring straight at me. His eyes were dark, deeper than anything I could explain, as if he wanted to pull me into the depths with him. I felt my whole body tremble, but I tried to keep calm. That's when he pointed at me, murmuring something I couldn't hear. I tried to convince myself it was an illusion, something caused by the fog. But then the cargo ship's systems went dead. The engine died, the lights went out, and I realized we were completely adrift. It was as if the ocean itself had decided to leave us there, stranded with that presence. The cargo ship began to turn slowly, pulled toward the ghost ship. I could hear the cries of my crew blending with the sounds of the waves and wind. Some started to pray. Others desperately tried to restart the engine. I wanted to scream too, but I was frozen watching the captain, who was now much closer. It was as if he was draining the last remnants of hope from me. And then he spoke. His voice was low, distant. "You too will rest at the bottom of the sea, like me and my crew." I had never felt such terror. But somehow, I summoned the last bit of strength I had and shouted for everyone to try to restart the engine. I saw the men, terrified, obeying, pulling levers and pressing buttons, as I felt the empty gaze of the captain fixed on me, like a shadow that would never leave. After what felt like an eternity, the engine sputtered to life, and the cargo ship started to move slowly. Every meter felt like a victory. Bit by bit, we distanced ourselves from the ghost ship, and the captain continued to watch us with that impassive stare until he disappeared into the fog. The sea calmed, but no one said a word. We sailed in silence, our hearts pounding, trying to make sense of what had just happened. In the distance, as the last traces of fog dispersed, I saw the shadow of the ghost ship vanish, like a nightmare fading with the dawn. Those empty eyes still haunt me, and the dark whisper of the captain echoes in my memory. Every time I sail through dark waters, I feel that same chill, as if the sea's graveyard is still calling, waiting for the moment when, finally, he and I meet again. The Midnight Ferry. I've always had a knack for getting myself tangled in stories that no sane person would even attempt. When I first heard about the Midnight Ferry, I thought it was just another tall tale, a fisherman's legend, something to scare tourists and keep the locals away from the river at night. But that night, I learned it was far more than just a story. It was early autumn, and the air had a biting chill. I was in a small, quiet town, the kind of place that felt frozen in time. A massive river cut through the area, and everyone said that nobody, absolutely nobody, crossed it on the ferry after midnight. They claimed that if anyone dared, the ferry would appear, but not to take you across. Naturally, I decided this was the adventure I'd been looking for. I put on my jacket, packed my flashlight with fresh batteries, and made my way to the loading dock. The silence was absolute. Only the sound of water lapping against the shore broke the stillness, and even that sound was almost hypnotic, eerily calm. I stood there for a while watching the water. When I checked my watch, it was just a few minutes before midnight. And then I heard it, the sound of a chain dragging against rough stone, sharp and insistent, slicing through the silence. I looked toward the river, and there it was, an old, decrepit ferry, falling apart, with a lone ferryman at the bow. He was gaunt, almost skeletal, wearing an old hat and a tattered, time-worn cloak. He didn't say a word. He just extended his hand to me, in a silent gesture that felt like an invitation. An inexplicable force seemed to pull me toward the ferry. I took a step forward, and before I knew it, I was boarding. The ferryman let the chain go, and in silence, we began the crossing. As we moved further from the shore, a dense fog began to wrap around us. My flashlight barely illuminated beyond the edge of the ferry. The opposite bank was completely out of sight. I noticed that the water, once calm, had started to ripple, with small waves lapping against the sides of the boat, making an unsettling sound. And then I saw them, hands rising from the water, thin, pale, bony fingers, as if they belonged to someone who had been down there a long, long time, waiting to come up. They reached out toward the ferry, trying to grasp the edge. A chill ran down my spine as I realized what I was seeing. I backed away to the center of the boat, but the hands were everywhere, gliding silently over the surface, creeping closer and closer, grasping for anything they could find. That's when the ferryman began to murmur. His voice was low and rough. "They come for those who dare to cross. None return from the middle of the river." I wanted to escape, to jump into the water, but those hands, those damn hands, seemed to multiply. One of them got too close and latched onto the edge, its fingers tapping against the wood. And the ferryman just stared at me with a cold smile, indifferent to my terror. He knew what was going to happen. Then one of the hands clamped onto my ankle and started pulling. I tried to grab the edge of the boat, but another hand locked onto my wrist, and in a flash, I was being dragged out of the ferry. I felt the icy water engulf me. It was as if the water was alive, pulling me down along with those hands. They were everywhere, grabbing me, holding onto my legs, my arms. I screamed, kicked, but it was useless. I was being pulled deeper into the dark depths, and with each second, I could feel myself sinking further and further. Everything went dark. I don't know how long I was down there in the icy darkness of the river, but suddenly, I felt a current let go of me. My body floated to the surface, and before I could understand what was happening, everything faded. When I opened my eyes, I was back on the shore alone. The ferry was gone, and I had no idea how I had gotten out of the river. All I know is that ever since that night, those hands still haunt me every time I dare to close my eyes. If you love mysteries and the supernatural, subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Leave a like to support the work and share with friends who are into the supernatural. Your engagement keeps these secrets alive.